now on to the actual mixing process. So you have the stems, or you're mixing your own track and everything is good to go. You're sitting down and you're ready to get started. And now here you are again presented with more presentations. And this presentation is on the mixing mindset. But honestly, if you've made it this far through the courses, through 101 and 102, the actual technical processes and plugins and things we're going to be using isn't going to be that new or that foreign to you. And honestly, of all the presentations in this section, of all the videos in this section, this is undoubtedly the most important one that you're going to watch, because this really sets the tone for everything that you're going to be doing. And I just want to make one additional point that isn't really explicitly stated in the following slides, but that point is attitude. Okay, so many of us, and this is what marketers prey on, is the fact that we look at ourselves maybe as new to mixing, that we're going to be bad at it, that we're going to be amateur at it, and that we're not going to get as good, in quotes, again, this is all subjective, as good as the professionals or as the other music that we're listening to. And if you go and you sit down and you're getting ready to mix a track, and this is the same thing that's true about competing as an athlete, like I was a tennis player and this was a big thing, is if you go into a match thinking you're going to lose, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy that you're probably going to lose. And mixing music is the same way. If you have convinced yourself that because you don't have the right gear, because you don't have the right experience, or some other factor, if you convince yourself before you sit down to make that track, or excuse me, to mix that track, it's the same thing for making music, that it's going to be a bad mix or it's going to be a bad track, then it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. So a big component to all of this is just staying positive, believing in yourself, having confidence when you sit down that you're going to make a killer mix, because you know what? Even without a lot of technical knowledge or without the fanciest gear, you absolutely can. And I'm not trying to say that new gear isn't going to make a mix better, because maybe it could. And new gear is great and it's fantastic and we love getting stuff new, but it's not going to make or break your mix. What's more likely to make or break your mix is the attitude you have going in. And unfortunately today, and this is what I noticed when I did a lot of research here, there's all of these things like top 5 mistakes that amateur mix engineers make, or the top 10 reasons or top 10 features of an amateur mix as compared to a professional one, and all of these things that's absolute like baloney in my opinion. They're just convincing you that you're not going to be as good, and then to get as good you need to buy this, that, or the other. And it's absolutely true that you could buy whatever it is that they're selling you and it might make you better at mixing, but you can already be really good at mixing with what you have, and you can always be getting better. So go in there with a lot of confidence, go in there with that positive mindset, and it's really amazing what the positive attitude can do. And if you have that sort of an attitude going in, I can guarantee that you're going to make something that you're super proud of and that other people are also going to enjoy the sound of and are going to like to listen to. So now on to more of like the technical considerations here, beginning with perspective, or I should say having a fresh perspective. And this is true for both mixing your own work and mixing just any work in general, so from somebody else. Let's start with mixing your own work. So typically, the reason you're really encouraged not to mix your own work is because of a lack of perspective. Just meaning that you've been working on this track for so long, and you've been trying to get everything just right. And in the computer, this is especially true because you can sit there and fiddle with parameters forever, that you actually are starting to not hear the song fresh anymore. You are anticipating what it's going to sound like. You assume it's going to sound a particular way, and it can really work and play on your mind like this. And it's true. I know in the past sometimes I've made a song. I'm like, man, this is really good. I'm just going to sit down and mix this right away because I just want to put it up online and be done with it and move on to the next thing. And I do that. I mix it. I think everything is good to go. I think it all sounds great. It's exactly the way I want it to be. And then a couple months later, you go back and listen to the track, and suddenly you realize, uh-oh, I really should have done some different things in the mix because certain frequencies are popping out. This is sounding too loud. This is sounding weird and not how I expected it was going to sound. And that's all because you lost perspective and you jumped in there with a lot of preconceived notions of what the sound was. So this is why when you are mixing your own work, and it's still completely okay to mix your own work. This isn't like it's a bad thing, but you do want to give yourself a pretty good amount of time before you go back to that track. Just enough time to have a fresh perspective, a fresh listen to it. So this is why I wrote stay as far away from the track for as long as you can. Within reason. Normally 1 or 2 weeks is more than enough time for you to get that fresh perspective when you go back and listen to it. And what really helps to even expedite this process further is to mix something else first. So with our site, you're lucky because you have, the different stem options that I'm providing you, and maybe people are going to be nice enough to allow their music to be mixed. Or you can even go and make another song. And the make another song approach is very useful because if you go off and you make another song, you're now getting so deeply invested and involved in that new track that once that's finished and you go back and listen to the old one, you definitely are going to have that newfound and fresh perspective and you'll be ready to mix it. Now, during the mixing process, for all situations, whether this is your own work or somebody else's, you also can lose perspective while you're making the music. And in order to regain that perspective, you're going to need to take breaks and also know when to stop. So we'll be going into these a little bit further and explain why exactly that's so important in this presentation. But just know that while you're mixing a song, it's also possible if you've spent too much time with it or you're really focused in on a particular part that you can lose perspective and start to make kind of strange decisions. And this kind of feeds in here to this healthy mind, healthy body approach that at least I personally have to mixing. And what I think is maybe most important in the whole mixing process is approaching it feeling very fresh and being ready and engaged and wanting to mix this track. So our hearing is a very complex mechanism. We know that it involves both physical and neurological processes. So there's like the mechanical processes of the actual sound pressure, air pressure, whatever, those fluctuations coming into your ear. You have the eardrum, you have the cochlea, all of like the membrane fluid. I can't remember all of the specific words, so I'm not going to try. But those are all like physical things. They're actually happening. And then, of course, it goes off to the brain, and the brain tries to interpret these sounds or tries to interpret this physical phenomena into then what we are perceiving and understanding as sound. And it's a very complicated process. And for that reason, many factors can affect the way we perceive sound. And you know this to be true. Your state of mind, aka your healthy mind, plays a big role in how you're hearing. So if you're really depressed, for example, and I know I've been there before. So if you're really down in the dumps and you're really depressed and, you're like out to eat with some people, you'll notice how you can completely choose to tune them out if you want to, and then kind of wallow in your own self-pity. And so the person's talking to you and you're looking at them, but you're like, I am not listening to a word they're saying. It's not as if the physical process isn't happening, but you've lost focus. You're not focusing in on the sound. You're not focusing in on what that person's saying. And the same thing can be true for if you're mixing music when you're really depressed. If your mind is constantly wandering to something else and you're losing that focus, then the mix probably is going to suffer because of it. And then there's also physical factors too. If you're really tired or you're really sick, and I've put a lot of different examples on here, you know that everything your body is telling you is go to sleep, get that extra rest. And if your body is constantly screaming that to you while you're sitting down and mixing, again, it's probably going to affect the final outcome of that mix. And again, this is probably focus related, but actual fatigue is also, a physical thing. And then additionally, I have one more example here that I don't want to go into too much detail on, but there's this concept, and you can look it up, called the temporary threshold shift. So the extreme example is if you go to a rock concert and it's really loud, which most are, after that set has finished, you'll notice that if you try to have like a normal conversation with somebody at your regular speaking levels, you can't understand what that person is saying. And so you have to scream really loudly. And this is because your actual brain has clicked in and said, you are potentially going to damage your hearing. I'm going to do something to stop that. Okay. And so the brain will allow your hearing to kind of like clamp down on some of these frequencies and the really loud noises. And so you're actually protecting your hearing in a way. I mean, you're still damaging it, but you're damaging it at a slower rate in this situation. But this can like last for a really, really long time. So you're trying to talk to your friends and you're unable to do it. I know I had one experience where it was like 3 or 4 days of a threshold shift, and it was absolutely brutal. Since that day, I've actually never gone to another concert again. So that's just to give you an idea. But even more subtly, when you're mixing music, if you really get focused in on a particular frequency range, or you're mixing at maybe a slightly too loud a volume, you can have more subtle threshold shifts where, in order then to compensate, and when you're doing it in a mixed context, a lot of times you don't even realize this is happening. And so you start to then compensate for it by making things even brighter or making things even louder, and then it throws off the balance. So when you do take those really crucial breaks, here we go. When you take those really crucial breaks, you'll be able to then regain that focus and then hopefully bring it back if you've went a little overboard. So the difference between making and mixing music. With making music, which is kind of the focus of this website, I believe you can make music wherever, whenever, however, and in whatever state of mind you may be. So, and you know this to be true. I mean, so much music has been made under the influence of psychedelics. A lot of people nowadays will like sleep deprive themselves before they sit down and make music. I personally can't do that, but then again, I'm not the greatest musical artist in the world, so maybe that's part of it. But people will do all sorts of wacky things in order to get themselves in the creative state of mind for making music. And that's totally okay, and it's almost encouraged, because this is about the decision making and the sounds and the parts and how they're coming together. But with mixing, you're trying to put the pieces together in a coherent way. And so with mixing, it's really all about consistency. So whenever possible, you want to mix in the same room, using the same audio interface, what's kind of coloring and giving you the sound, and also on the same basic sound setup. So the speakers, if you have a subwoofer, all of this sameness is going to help you with consistency, because when you think about it, mixing really is all about kind of relating it to your last experience and knowing what that mix sounds like on your system, so that you're making the right decisions and you're getting the balances that you actually want to get. Now, we talked about this in an earlier video, but it can't be stated enough that you need to make sure your room isn't working against you. So make sure you have that set of headphones to check things, especially if you're not working in a specific mix environment or in a control room type environment. And some of you are going to say, and maybe there are some mixing engineers who are actually watching this, are going to say, well, back in the day, we used to go to all sorts of different studios, go from one to the other based on the artist, based on where we needed to go, wherever the work was. And normally, the way that would work is every mix engineer would have some kind of a reference CD that they would use and play in that new space, in that new environment, to get a feel for how that room was coloring the sound. And then they would use that as the basis. And when you're a professional and you mix every day, your ability to figure that out is a lot quicker. Here at the Sormena project, I'm assuming that you're mostly music makers, so mixing isn't an everyday thing. And if it's not an everyday thing, then consistency is especially important. And also, with consistency, being in the same state of mind and body every time you sit down to mix. And I wrote here, preferably whatever the normal state of mind and body is for you. And this goes back to perspective and to making those comparisons. If you mix one day and you're feeling really good and energetic and you're good to go, and then the next day you're lethargic and depressed and all this, it's going to alter the way that you're hearing the sound, and it's ultimately going to alter the way that you mix. Another question that I've read, no one's ever asked me this personally, but I'm going to weigh in on it anyway, is if you, for some reason, drink like 8 cups of coffee a day, when you sit down to mix, did you suddenly like stop doing that sort of behavior? Is that going to impact the way you're hearing? And, maybe it will impact the way you're hearing, but if that's the normal state for you, then you need to make sure that you continue to do that. Now, for your health, you probably do want to slowly wean off, but I know that for a lot of people, that's just impossible. They have to drink like 6 cups of coffee a day. And if that is you, then don't suddenly not drink the coffee on the day you're going to sit down and mix, because that's going to alter everything, and it's probably going to throw you way out of whack. Okay, on now to specifically state of mind. So we referenced state of mind before, but what exactly is the state of mind that you want to get yourself in? Well, everybody's very different, and only you're really going to know what's normal for you, but I would say these are more of the general traits. So the first one is to be relaxed, and by extension to relaxed, also to be comfortable. You don't want to be uncomfortable. You don't want to be worried or anxious. You want to be able to put all of your focus and attention into the mix. And that's why the second bullet here, being focused, is honestly the most important thing. So whatever you have to do to get focused, that's kind of what you have to do. And then also well rested. So you want to make sure you get a good night's sleep before, your ears are rested, your body's rested. And this is all just so that you can sit down and be focused on the mix without losing attention or drifting in and out, thinking about this, thinking about that. Those are all things that end up hurting the mix a lot more than, say, not having 800 EQs or 60 different compressors. It's the focus that's really the crucial element here, not the tools. So mixing as meditation, and I read this a lot, but I've noticed a trend with this. And first of all, mixing as meditation, as in you mix and then you get into a meditated state of mind, incredibly, incredibly rare. If you find that mixing, just the process of doing this when you're feeling like anxious or you're not feeling good, actually puts you in a relaxed, focused, and seemingly well-rested state of mind, then honestly, mixing should be your career. And the people who describe this as happening are normally professionals, and they've chosen the right profession. Mixing is actually the thing that gives them meaning, okay? And that's not going to be true for all of you. And when music making, we're really talking about a multi-stage, a multi-step process. And in that whole process, assuming you're doing everything from start to finish, including the mixing, there'll be parts that you love, and there will be parts that do just feel like work. And primarily as music makers, at least I'm assuming on this website, we often have to put ourselves in the correct state of mind to mix and not the other way around. So it's going to be rare that if we've been making the music and we've never really gone into the zone or in the flow-like state, that suddenly when we're mixing, that's going to happen. Very rare. So you actually have to, get yourself channeled, get yourself ready, and get yourself focused. And then I put this next bullet here just to illustrate this even further. If you normally struggle to make music, just that whole production process, then you typically also have to put yourself in the state of mind to make music. So for some of us, and I know for me, there are certain processes where I can kind of get in the zone and it almost becomes instinctual. It almost becomes like a meditative activity. I know that there are certain processes where that happens. For me, mixing isn't one of them. And for that reason, I have to put myself in the right state of mind. So meditation as meditation seems like a weird thing to say, but that is what I meant. And this is all about getting in the right state of mind. So ironically, doing some actual meditation, and the type doesn't matter, and it doesn't have to be a big new agey thing. Even just sitting and just focusing on your breathing for 5 or 6 minutes can really help settle your mind, settle the nerves, and help you get focused on the mix that you're about to do. I mean, this is the point of meditation. Meditation can help you focus on whatever the task is that you have at hand. So whether it's like writing a book, painting a picture, whatever, meditating is all about just helping you to focus in on whatever the next task is that you have to do, or the tasks that you're going to be doing throughout the day. So in this case, I find that meditating, especially for me, if mixing isn't the thing I do every day and it's not something that I really love, Meditating absolutely helps me get in that right state of mind, but I know that that's not for everybody. So whatever works for you is what you're going to want to do. Okay, so you have to know what it is that's going to help you get focused and ready to jump into that mix. Clearing your schedule is another really big one, especially if mixing isn't the thing that you do on a common basis. You need to make sure that you commit to a day, and on that day you sit down and you mix your track. Okay, no excuses, just sit down and do it, commit to it, and that really helps quite a bit because these are all things where you're telling yourself, this is what I have to do today. And when you do that, it normally helps quite a bit. Stretching, breathing exercises, those can be useful. I absolutely hate to stretch, but I do find that it does help clear the mind and gets me focused on what I'm going to be doing throughout the day. And then the last one, this is just a personal thing that I do and it helps, is to literally just tell yourself, a lot of times throughout the previous day that the following day you're going to be mixing a track. And by planting that seed in your mind, then normally when I wake up the next day, I'm really engaged and I'm really ready to mix whatever song it is that I have to mix. Focused listening. Okay, these are the two primary fundamental principles. I'm using a lot of adjectives that are going to help you with your mixing. So fundamentally, mixing is what? Mixing is about being focused, and it's about critically listening. And that's really all it is. And then making decisions based on your focus and your critical listening. So here's where you just have to do what you have to do to stay focused. And you have to do what you have to do to make sure you can critically listen for as long as it's going to take. Normally, it's, 4 or 5 hours of a day. That's pretty much the average for how long it takes to kind of like mix a track. And breaks. And so breaks are really the key to this. Do what you have to do to stay focused. Do what you have to do to make sure you can critically listen the whole day. This is where the breaks come in, and they come in a big way. Taking breaks when mixing isn't like you're copping out. It's actually a part of the mixing process. So don't think that, oh man, like I'm just sitting around and doing nothing. Don't think that you're really wasting your time and you're being not being productive. These breaks are actually going to make you more productive, and I consider them a crucial part of the mix as a whole. So taking breaks is essential for both focus and full day critical listening. Why? Well, because it's going to help give your brain a rest. It'll also help give your ears a rest. And we've already talked about why you might want to do those things. So when to break? In my opinion, this is really up to you, but you want to break when you start to lose focus. So if you notice after 30 minutes, your brain is starting to wander to something else, you're like, oh crap, I really need to walk the dog, or I really need to, vacuum the basement, whatever it is, you probably should go and do that task if you're losing focus. And then just tell yourself that, okay, I only made it 30 minutes this time. I'm going to do better the next time. And so much of this is just conditioning yourself. So the more times you do this, the better you're going to get. And eventually you'll find that you can sit there for 2 hours and really solidly focus on what you're doing. And you also need to break when your ears are becoming fatigued. But it's not like there's this hard and fast rule. Everybody's different. So this depends on a lot of factors. One of the factors is the volume level that you're mixing at. The louder the volume you're mixing at, the more frequently you're going to need to take breaks. But I'd say at moderate volume levels, and again, how do you define moderate? But at moderate volume levels, I'd say you want to go maybe 2 hours max before you sit down and take that break. Now, it's very easy to keep going. And I've done this. I'm sure many of you have done this. You're like, you know what? I'm right near the end. It's only going to be another 30 minutes. I'm just going to push through it. Suddenly that 30 minutes turns into an hour and a half. And then you haven't realized that your ears have been fatiguing for the last 2.5 hours. And then suddenly you do take the break and you come back. And then you have to reverse mix the whole thing because you've pushed things all sorts of out of whack because you were making decisions based on your ears not being focused and not being fresh. So it's okay to go overboard, and it's okay to work when your ears are fatiguing, but you have to realize and accept that when you do take that break and come back, that you might need to make some changes because you've done things that probably are throwing things out of whack. So always better safe than sorry. Take those breaks and give yourself a chance to really reset. So the next question here is how to break. And fundamentally, there's only one rule, which is do not listen to music whenever possible. This is about resetting your ears, not engaging them further. And so I should say here, don't actively listen to music. But you'll notice that this is almost impossible after you've been mixing. So if you do, for example, turn on the TV and you're listening to the dialogue, you'll start to notice how even if you're trying to not actively listen, you will. You'll really hone in on those frequencies. You're listening to how they've like mixed it for TV, and now you're not actually doing yourself any favors at all. You're just continuing to go into mix work mode, which is what you're trying to avoid. So you want to do something that's going to refresh the brain and also refresh the ears, or I should say reset the brain and reset the ears. So just some examples here. Meditating is helpful. Stretching, again, I hate stretching, but I find it to be very useful in this case. Some kind of light exercise. Typically this would be going for a walk outside, something like that. Reading, I would say preferably fiction. Nothing that's music related, because the more music related stuff that you're coming across, the more you're going to be thinking about your mix. And that's what you're kind of trying to avoid here. So even, for example, coming onto our website, if you're in the middle of a mix, I wouldn't recommend visiting our website, because I don't think that's going to be as quality of a break as you could get by doing something else. You know, things like eating, rehydrating yourself, preferably water, but you know, everybody's different, or any activity that you enjoy that isn't too addictive or something that's going to suddenly put you off on a different path. The whole point of that day when you're mixing a track is to mix that track. And you want to remind yourself of that if you find yourself taking a break and then getting too engaged in something else. How long to break? Obviously, this varies by person. Might be just a 20-minute sit-down break, or even just like 10 minutes of meditation after you've worked for an hour. You might give yourself like a 1-hour lunch break. Professionally, this is kind of what you have to learn how to do. If you're mixing every single day, you have to mix for like 3 or 4 hours in the morning, take that hour break, really get the most out of it during lunch, and then come back and mix for another 3 or 4 hours. Or if you're more of like maybe, doing this at home and time isn't as much of a factor and there's not a deadline, a 2-hour walk in the woods after you've spent most of the morning and afternoon on a mix can be exactly what you need to really reset everything and come back with a very fresh perspective, and ready to then push through to the very end. And I put here at the bottom, longer breaks can actually be more beneficial than shorter ones, assuming you have the motivation to get back into it. So only you know how long you can break for before maybe you start to just drift off the path a little bit. So, do things within your limits, and only you really know what that is. So, so much of this is kind of based on personal, personality and what makes you unique. Okay, so the next topic I want to bring up here is the mix in a day approach. I highly, highly recommend having a final mix ready by the end of the day, aka getting everything done in one day. And this has to do with perspective again. If you're mixing for 3 weeks on the same track, you're going to start to completely lose perspective. And at that point, you've also really forgot one of our key points from earlier on, which is knowing when to stop. If you force yourself to do this within a day, within like an 8-hour or 10-hour window, then you at least know that you have to stop. So that can be useful. And unlike making music, it's totally okay to go fast and almost rush through a mix. And this is because your ears are still fresh and your instincts are sharp if you're moving quickly and doing a lot at the beginning. And you'll find that a lot of mix engineers actually do recommend this sort of approach. And I find that it is more useful going fast than really taking my time and, potentially then losing that perspective. And the more experience you have with mixing, the faster it tends to go. And you'll end up getting results that are perhaps a little bit more to your liking or more of what you envisioned. So that's the mix in a day approach. It's not something you have to do, but it is something that I would recommend. So at the end of the day, after you've decided I'm quitting this project until, we'll say in a second, until a later date, now would actually be a good time to maybe listen to a little bit of music. And this was such an eye-opening experience for me. I think the very first time I ever mixed a song, when I then, went and opened up my library and listened to a little bit of music, I was astonished at the detail that I was hearing. I was listening to these songs in completely a new way. And it just reminds you of how amazing the brain really is and how much you can really focus on something and how much you can alter your perceptions, without even using additional stimulants. You can do it just on your own based on the way you focus. If you've been spending a lot of time on a particular part, like let's say a vocal, you'll really be able to focus in on that vocal and hear the way it was kind of mixed in context with everything else. And again, in new ways that you've never really heard this track before. Now, this won't necessarily make your mixing any better or the mix that you've just done any better, but I think it's a really cool illustration of how critically you can listen with practice and experience. And again, this goes back to prove that anybody can do it. It's more about the focus and attention that you put in than it is the tools you have or even necessarily the experience. But of course, experience is really important. So on to the final mix. And here we come back to wanting to regain that fresh perspective. So after you finish that mix from the day and you've quit and you've closed it, I say definitely go at least maybe 24 hours, or at the very least take that night, sleep on it, and then open it up again and review it one final time. I tend to find that maybe 48 hours is the ideal for this, and I know that this isn't always possible because of time constraints or deadlines, but if it's your own music, you should be able to do this. 48 hours or so, come back, listen to it one final time, and if you hear some things that are out of place, go ahead and fix it. Don't second guess it, just fix it, get it to where you want it to be, and then you are done. So this has been a lengthy presentation on the mixing mindset, but as I mentioned before, I think this is really probably the most important presentation that you are going to see in this section. And more often than not, when you read like the top 10 common mixing mistakes or any of those sort of things, I'd say there is no top 10, there's no top 20, there's no top 5, there's a top 1, and that has to do with your mindset. So keep it positive, be confident, remember some of the things that we've talked about in this presentation, and you should have absolutely no problems in mixing any kind of music.